Carolyn Mcdade is an activist who worked tirelessly for social justice. The night she wrote the prayer, Spirit of Life, she recalls saying to a friend that she felt like a piece of dried cardboard that had lain in the attic for years. Just open wide the door and I'll be dust. Weary from the world and the weight of the endless work for solidarity in Central America, she describes arriving home that evening. She says, I walked through my house in the dark. I found my piano, and that was my prayer. May I not drop out. It was not written, but prayed. I knew more than anything that I wanted to continue in faith with the movement. Her prayer, Spirit of Life, has become a central hymn for Unitarian Universalists. During the years I spent working the front lines of marriage equality in Minnesota, I often felt the same weariness that Carolyn spoke of. Actually, the weariness feels magnified right now as we witness what's happening in our country with the backdrop of the Delta variant. We have a country that is increasingly divided. We're witnessing extreme legislation fueled by unchecked capitalism and a far-right conservative agenda, which is causing real harm to the globe, to women, and to people on the margins. A prayer which is probably familiar to some of you, written by Reverend Meg Riley, that prayer for difficult conversations was my go-to text to start the numerous trainings I did in various faith communities. And it continues to resonate in our current context. I actually just posted it on my wall last week. Reverend Riley's words reminded me of the courage required to speak one's truth in love and the humility and spiritual grounding required for sustained social justice work. The prayer ends with, may every word I speak be filtered through my heart. May every word I hear be filtered through my heart. May my inner judge sit this one out. May I breathe into loving kindness for myself and you, and may I accept that we will both do this imperfectly. Prayer can help us name our boldest vision and our deepest longings. Through prayer, we cry our laments and we lift up the pain of others. And prayer is also a gift. It's freely given and it's powerfully received. Yet it seems to be something that many Unitarian Universalists are uncomfortable with. When I was serving at White Bear UU Church, I joined a class, you heard some of those voices, which was focused on the book Simply Pray. You heard a few of those reflections during the chalice lighting. I enjoyed reading Simply Pray and especially noted the openness of the author and an invitation to grapple with many questions I and we have had about prayer. The question of to whom do we pray can often be the greatest stumbling block. I swear I spent a semester in seminary writing down the objects of people's prayers as we were in classes. I had a little page full of them. And the more I paid attention, the more paralyzed I became as I felt unable to comfortably name anything. I kind of like the idea of that golden, warm light of unconditional love holding the universe that someone named in that class. But honestly, though, I'd have to write that out on a little Post-it note and put it near my candle if I were to remember it. I wasn't prepared for the outcome of ministry training, being that people would ask me to pray when I was unprepared. It was during my ministerial intern with Reverend Justin Schroeder, who was the senior minister at First Universalist. At the end of just a random staff meeting, he turned to me and he asked, Laura, would you like to lead us out in prayer? Oh my God, I was in such shock that I could only giggle with nervousness as my face became flushed and I had to decline. But as the months evolved, I learned to live into the language and presence of prayer that not only made me comfortable with it, but actually begin to long for more prayer. I discovered I could open prayer with a range of names for the holy, or I could just simply start by naming that which we were experiencing, calling forth the sacredness of the moment, just without even pointing to a specific source. For instance, I may pray like, grateful for this time we have spent together, knowing the tenderness of our thoughts and words, may we return to our daily lives mindful of this sacred community, touched by its joyful embrace and held in love. I also discovered that prayer was a place that I could bring my tender heart, my irrational fears and doubts, and some of my rational fears and doubts, and my love and my gratitude. I found that the more hectic things became, the more space I made for personal prayer, and it actually changed me. As I prepared this sermon during the past few days, I watched the news with disbelief and I shuddered at the Supreme Court decision in regard to the draconian Texas abortion restrictions. And I contacted shocked relatives in New York and Philadelphia who were dealing with the aftermath of Ida. And I began to hear this voice inside me urging me not just to preach about prayer, but to return to my daily practice. The words of that congregant's reflection saying, I am becoming more calm, satisfied, aware of my inner spiritual growing somehow. That congregant said, actually, words I use don't really explain what is happening. Reading those words again, it called me back into a practice that I know impacts me, and it impacts the way I engage in the world in profound ways. William Ellery Channing, a renowned Unitarian minister of the early 19th century, said, the true spirit of prayer is submission of ourselves to the good of the whole, to the purposes of infinite love. I'm going to repeat that. The true spirit of prayer is submission of ourselves to the good of the whole, to the purposes of infinite love. As you all know, prayer is guided by many world religions, and it can look quite different in varied settings. At the same time, the essence of prayer, that attitude of reverence and humility and wonder, shares a similarity across many faiths. My friend Rabbi Michael Latz describes prayer like this. Prayer is the response, the visceral, tender, cellular, radically absurd perspective that we are more than a mass of cells. This means that this life means something, and our great spiritual responsibility is to seek out that meaning and hold it and shape it and demand it grow. Prayer, it can offer a clearing, it can offer a pause or a breath that takes us away from ordinary time, and it invites us into an ageless time and wisdom. When I maintain a daily spiritual practice, which I'm going to do once again, congregants can hold me to that, it becomes a calming and illuminating companion, which reminds me of the pain and the promise in my life, in our lives, and in this world. It opens my heart and my spirit to others. Our faith, it really doesn't have prescribed prayers or prayer rituals. Instead, it invites us to create meaningful spiritual practices, like Diana just led us through some of those ways of opening our hearts and calming our spirits. This openness allows incredible creativity in personal meaning making. A congregant once shared with me her daily prayer that uses a framework of the circle of the sun. And this was a full body prayer. It engaged in physical movements and intentions that turn to the east and the south and the west and the north. Each direction brings in different elements, and she holds herself and others in this circle of prayer. So imagine she turns to the sun rising in the east, and she brings warmth and color that it calls forth in blessing, then turns to the south that brings illuminating heat, which brings about clarity about the world and its needs and our role in creating and resolving them. And the west for her brings these lengthening shadows as the sun sets. The shadows show the world within, and the north is the sun below our feet, traveling to light to the other side of the world and giving us permission to rest in the safety until the sun rises again. I'm really often struck when people share their practices and what helps hold them and others. And I'm reminded, I know these MSU folks have heard me talk about this before, of when I was sitting in the pews at Unity Church Unitarian, where I raised my sons many years ago, and I was listening to the Reverend Jan Eller Isaacs preach. And at one point in her sermon, she spoke of her morning prayers. And she shared that she often holds specific individuals from the congregation in her prayers. was the way maybe she leaned over that pulpit and spoke to us. I just felt shocked and moved, and I just thought inside, like, she prays for us? I don't know, it was a revelation to me. It kind of shifted my sense of her congregational ministry into the intimacy of her own home in the morning and the sacred silence that she created. And I don't know if I was among one of those she ever prayed for and named, but I just felt held in a love at that moment that touched me deeply. Chances are that all of you who are connected to a congregation have been held in a similar way by a minister or by fellow congregants. Anne Lamott, who is one of my favorite writers on spirituality, said, "I don't know much about God and prayer, but I have come to believe over the past 25 years that there's something to be said about keeping simple prayer." No, about keeping prayer simple. Sorry about that. She names 3 words: help, thanks, and wow. She goes on to say, "You may in fact be wondering what I even mean when I use the word prayer. It's certainly not what TV Christians mean. It's not for display purposes like plastic sushi or neon." She says, prayer is private. Even when we pray with others, it is communication from the heart to that which surpasses understanding. Let's say it's the communication from one's heart to God. Or if that is too triggering or ludicrous a concept for you, to the good, the force that is beyond our comprehension, but that in our pain or supplication or relief, we don't need to define or have proof of or any established contact with. She said, let's say it is what Greeks called the really real that lies within us beyond the scrim of our values, positions, convictions, and wounds. Or let's say it's a cry from deep within to life or to love with the capital L's. In these 3 prayers, she said, asking for assistance from a higher power or this greater love or life, appreciating what we have that is good, and feeling the awe at the world around us that can get us through the day and show us the way forward. Help, thanks, wow. I think it's important for all of us to note that spiritual practices like prayer, they're not going to be done perfectly. I don't think any spiritual practices are. And if you're like me, they'll come in fits and starts. Conversations and readings and educational opportunities have all moved me into a period of spiritual practice. I remember after a workshop on Buddhism, I became really interested in that prayer of loving kindness mentioned in the chalice lighting. That prayer is one that expands from the individual and then it goes out in rings out into the world. I was terrible at remembering the precise words, so my practice let that go, and I just followed that pattern of those rings of the familiar to the unfamiliar, from those I know and love to those who challenge my universalist heart. And it's hard to pray for those you know are causing real harm. But to simply curse them or hate them feels like a familiar, deep groove of dissatisfying behavior that leaves me personally feeling depressed and despondent. From that location, I can go nowhere. I was saying to Katie that I think we often preach what we need to hear, and this topic of prayer is one I return to almost annually. Perhaps it's because it reminds me that there were times when I felt the continued groundedness and open-heartedness that stems from this practice. For a long time, I brought prayer into my sleeping hours. I weaned myself from several decade-old addiction of Minnesota Public Radio that I would listen to before I dozed off with little headphones in, or I would do again when I woke up in the middle of the night. At one point, I had a ring of prayer beads given to me by a congregant. I saw that Katie had that ring of prayer beads in the latest hymn. Prayer beads are often an instrument that are used in several faith traditions, and I decided I slept better when I wasn't sleeping on one of the loose beads as I broke that little string over and over again. So instead, I moved to my 4 knuckles as my guide in my prayer practice. So I'd start with the first knuckle and I'd recite a known prayer such as Spirit of Life or the meditation on breathing. And this was a way to quiet myself and enter into a state of listening. My second knuckle calls me into reflection on where I have seen the holy in my day. And this could be something as small as remembering catching the eye of someone at Target, or the laughter of a neighbor's kid playing outside, or the sun on my dining room table. It can also be as large as a friend reaching out when I needed them, or a touching story I read in the paper or through social media, or an actual change of heart. The third knuckle provides me with a time to consider where I fell short. And this isn't a moment to reflect on what items still linger on my to-do list or some other sort of self-blame. Instead, it was a time for me to reflect on actions that take me further from love and joy and compassion, such as something that I might have in my head, like I had this profound conversation with my friend and I immediately thought of what I should have said instead of paying attention to what actually became of that conversation. Or sometimes I like to go to bed and think of all the weaknesses in my ministry instead of my strengths. I doubt any of you guys do that kind of thing. That final knuckle served as a prompt for prayers for others and those I wanted to hold in a loving embrace. And I have to admit that it is rare that I make it through this whole ring without falling asleep, but it gives me a prayerful grounding at the end of the day and throughout the night when I wake up. To be held in prayer, it just may not change the outcome. It might, it may not, but it can also remind us of our inherent worth and the beauty of our connection with a greater spirit and with each other. One of my favorite UU World articles was about the people in the pews of First Unitarian Church in Dallas as their minister, Daniel Cantor, distributed index cards to each of them. At the end of his sermon, he asked each of them to write down a prayer need. And I imagine for some, it just sort of poured out onto the card with a sigh of relief, and others may have struggled at his request. And then after those cards were written, they were placed in baskets, and these cries of the people had no names attached. And when the service was over, each person took a card and they were instructed to consider seriously that someone in the sanctuary would be asking for their prayers. In this UU World article, Reverend Cantor shared how congregants were affected by this sacred ritual. Connection, strength, courage, compassion were some of the words that were shared as a result. I know when I was a student in clinical pastoral education at Abbott Northwestern, total strangers would reach out their hands and hold them in mine as we entered into prayer. And sometimes we spoke ancient and words that were familiar to them, such as the Lord's Prayer. And other times I offered a spontaneous prayer, given that the patient willingly waited to hear words of love and care that I called forth into those sterile hospital rooms and challenging medical times. And I remember I was personally touched by prayers that were shared. I remember I was on call one Sunday afternoon when I decided to visit a patient in the psychiatric unit. The woman I visited had a file citing multiple diagnoses, and she was experiencing a tremendous amount of grief. As our time together came to an end, she asked if I wanted to pray, and I said yes. And she said she wanted to offer the prayer from her Native American tradition. And so I lowered my head and I closed my eyes and I held my hand together on the top of the table as she quietly sang a prayer in the language and the rhythm of her ancestors. And when she finished, she looked up at me and she said, "This is what my prayer means in English. Love your great-grandmother. Love your grandmother. Love your mother. Love your home. Love yourself." So beautiful, showing me that even from those who may be viewed from the public as broken, have this inner strength and beauty that not only was healing her, but healing me. For each of us who are a part of this complicated and often broken world, prayer can be a wellspring. Prayer can be a source of strength, and it can invite a posture of humility. It can be a container for our rage, a moment of peace, and it can also wake us up to the needs of the world and our own agency as part of it. May we sing our prayers. May we silently hold others as we sit in daily prayer or walk our prayers surrounded by nature or on the city streets. May we say our prayers at bedsides in the company of those who we deeply disagree with, or in recognition of times spent together, making meaning of our lives. Let the spirit of life and prayer sing in our heart all the stirrings of compassion. Let our hearts and souls be transformed by a greater love that will not let us go. Amen. We have a moment at our summer services. We've been letting people speak a bit, do some reflections on sermons. So we have just a few minutes, maybe about 5, if folks would like to share any thoughts they have, and then we will sing another hymn and move towards the closing of the service. I'm wondering if anybody else out there has this prayer practice or has a reflection on what you've heard today. Once again, Katie will be the woman in charge. I see Bruce.
One is kind of 2 points. One reaction, talking about praying for the people in the church. Do you mean there are people in our church that you think need to be prayed for? I'm not saying anything. And the other thing is, sometimes it's hard to figure out, is it prayer or is it I need to meditate to calm down? There are times where prayer feels more natural, but times where prayer doesn't seem quite like that right idea, and I need to find another way of approaching it. So I'll try and use some form of meditation to do that.
Yes, I think, spiritual practices are really work best for those who, kind of find a practice that really resonates with them. I am so relational that the prayer concept feels right for me. And I do pray for almost everybody in the congregation, Bruce. So there you go. But meditation certainly is, I think, a discipline I could stand to do. And I know a lot of people find a lot of strength from that. So thank you.
I see Jennifer from UUCM.
Good morning. Thank you for the reflections. I think it's super powerful when we think about someone else. And I guess for me, that's what prayer can be about too, when it's focused on someone else. It's like, I thought of you today. That is a powerful statement, I think. So I think maybe it can be just that simple sometimes.
Jennifer, I think that's what was sort of eating at me this week, was to get out of my own self and, put that spirit, that energy out to others. So thank you.
Pamela, you're ready.
I'll piggyback on what Jennifer just said. I find when I'm feeling very, very, weak or saddened because of events in the world or sadness for people that I know, praying for them and praying for things gives me strength and makes me feel personally better. But I think, yeah, there's this power that comes into when you pray for things other than yourself. And Laura, I just want to say once again, you have brought forth words that I sorely needed to hear right now. I think that my own prayerful practice, I know, gives me strength when I'm at a point of stumbling in my life. And so prayer keeps me going sometimes. And that kind of prayer is simply going outside and seeing the sunshine on a particular leaf of grass, or seeing a bird on the wing, or thankful prayer, grateful prayer.
Thank you, Pamela.
John Brand.
What was the first knuckle again?
The first knuckle was, a prayer. Like I do Spirit of Life. I do something to bring myself in, like a song or a little prayer that is like maybe those first breaths. We will post a recording of. We always post a recording of our sermons on our webpage as well. So if people want that, just know you can go there. I think it's usually by Tuesday or something.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mitzi, if you want to unmute yourself. I don't know where she went on my screen.
I'm here.
There you are.
I want to thank you, Reverend Laura, for your beautiful words today. I needed them very badly. My son is in ICU, cardiac ICU, away from me and my husband in Fairfax, Virginia. It's very sad, and it's hard to not be with him, but it's the way the rules are now. And the words that all of you said, that collectively praying or sending warmth and that to someone we love is really powerful. I felt this power today, and thank you for your words. And I ask you all to know that the fragility of life is very frightening, especially for a healthy 49-year-old man. So I ask all of you, as you go through your time, to just think of those of us that are struggling to just find a way to bring hope to ourselves. And I do have hope, but I just appreciate your words, and thank you.
Mitzi, my heart and prayers are with you. Thank you for sharing. As you said, it's that tenderness of life. I hope your son does okay. What is his name, Mitzi? Oh, you're muted.
His name is Andrew, and he has a daughter, Genevieve, and his wife, Anne, who both of them are with him, and they're the only ones that can be there. But they are able to hold his hand and let him, reassure him that he's going to do better. He just has an infection that it has been undetermined, that has affected his heart and his kidneys, and he got very sick very quickly.
Andrew, Anne, and Genevieve, thank you. I think we're going to have to move on, Katie. There are some notes in the chat. If people are chat readers, please feel free to go there. And in response to the sermon and in response to what we've heard following the sermon, we're going to sing together number 1030 in the Teal hymnal, Filled with Loving Kindness.